pressures, discontents are absolutely building up. And interestingly, amongst a whole bunch of different segments of the population, you mentioned the ultranationalists, the so-called turbo patriots. They clearly are thinking not just that they have a problem with the war so much as they have a problem with just how incompetent its management has been. You've got the oligarchs who are seeing their business empires under risk and their opportunities of being able to continue to enjoy the fruits of being connected to the outside world limited. And you have ordinary Russians who may not know exactly what's going on, but they're terrified, for example, about a new mobilization wave. And they just feel there is clearly something wrong if part of your territory is under foreign occupation.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by a regular voice here on Frontline. We always appreciate his time. Mark Galeotti, Honorary Professor at University College London. He's a highly respected expert in Russian politics and global crime, and is the author of many books, including Putin's Wars from Chechnya to Ukraine. Mark, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Good to be here.
Wanted to start off by getting your thoughts on what appears to be a shift in position from the US and the UK, but notably the US when it comes to restrictions placed on the use of long-range missiles by Ukraine inside Russia. Now, we haven't had any official confirmation on this, and some people are saying that Joe Biden is still a bit hesitant about giving the green light for this, but there certainly seems to be a bit of a gear change. What would be the significance of that if those restrictions were lifted?
Well, I mean, first of all, just to talk about the political question, yes, it does seem to be happening more slowly than expected. Look, remember that although Keir Starmer was over in Washington talking to Joe Biden, it's not really there that decisions are made. Decisions tend to be basically made by lots of negotiations between officials and then announced. And therefore, it was a bit of a surprise and in some ways a bit of a setback that there wasn't such an announcement. And it's not so much, I think, that the Americans are dragging their feet. It's rather that they do understand that Putin, in some ways, needs to be acclimated to any particular change, because he's been making some very, very sort of over-the-top statements about that this would essentially be the equivalent of declaring war on Russia. And it's more than an understanding that Putin can get his head round reversals, but in some ways tends to take time, and they don't want to bounce him into feeling that he has to respond in some escalatory way. Because the impact would be significant. I mean, this is the trouble. I mean, each time there's some new weapon system, whether it's the F-16s or HIMARS rockets, someone will crop up saying, this is it. This is the wonder weapon that is going to change the nature of the war. And that's quite dangerous because precisely it sets up expectations that are inevitably going to be dashed. This will allow the Ukrainians a new capability to be able to target military bases. And it's worth stressing that even the permission that is likely to be given will not be carte blanche. We're not going to see these weapons open to be used against civilian targets, even if the Ukrainians wanted to. It'll be very specifically military strategic targets, but at a wider range, and perhaps most importantly, with a very high level of precision. Because this has always been the kind of the trade-off. The Ukrainians do have systems that can target quite long range, but their accuracy and their capacity to get through Russian air defenses are always a little bit more questionable. These are very accurate, very effective weapon systems. So it's going to push further out the radius at which the Ukrainians can strike. And already we've seen it having its effect, because the aircraft that the Russians use to launch these quite formidable glide bombs, very large weapons, are now being pushed further out so that they're outside the storm shadow radius. And okay, it means that they can't be hit, but nonetheless, it means it's that much harder. They're going further into their range to actually be able to hit Ukraine. So look, this is an important step forward. It's not a war winner, but nonetheless, it is part of the overall process of supporting the Ukrainians.
It's interesting also how the West seems to be selling this as a response to Iran providing Russia with around 200 ballistic missiles. So it's a response as opposed to an escalation, I suppose, is how they're trying to brand it. I suppose one of the counter arguments to those who say this might be an escalation is the idea that actually the Kursk incursion proved once and for all that many of Putin's so-called red lines are just a bluff. And people would say if Ukraine can show that you can physically invade Russia and Putin won't reach, say, for tactical nuclear weapons, that goes to show that he's been bluffing about these red lines all along.
Yes, up to a point. I mean, there is what we're really talking about here is kind of boy that cried wolf scenario. In that, absolutely, from the very beginning, Putin has been trying to lay down these red lines to try and inhibit us from supporting Ukraine. I mean, the very notion of sending combat equipment to Ukraine in the first place was considered a red line. Then it was long-range artillery and rockets and attacks on the Kursk, on the Crimean bridge, and then most recently F-16s, and now it's this. And each time we pass these red lines, they turn out to be merely a sort of a slightly faint pink, and perhaps there'll be a day or two of additional raids on Ukrainian cities or something as a sort of vindictive punishment, but that's about it. However, we have to recognize two things. First of all, just because past red lines have been non-existent, really, it doesn't mean that there aren't any. And to be honest, though, I think that the real red lines are very different things. They're basically the presence, for example, were there NATO combat troops being deployed into Ukraine to fight? Were there NATO weapons being used against civilian targets? Or was there the prospect of imminently losing Crimea? I think those are really, for me, the three genuine red lines. So yes, we have to take it into account. But on this business of essentially branding this not as escalation, but as a response to the Iranian ballistic missiles, I mean, this is very disingenuous because, frankly, this is a process that started well before there was any talk of Iranian nuclear missiles. And my problem is that sometimes in the West, we get a little bit too carried away precisely with the spin. Which, fine, it matters within democratic political systems, but not necessarily so much with international relations. And I'm inclined to think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, after all, was one of the times when the world came closest to nuclear war. And there, when the Russians decided, or the Soviets rather, decided to send short-range nuclear missiles to Cuba, this was regarded as a sort of a terrible escalation. Whereas, as far as the Soviets were concerned, this was simply a response to the fact that the Americans had sighted short-range missiles in Turkey, just over their border. So the problem is that everyone finds their justifications. When we're in this kind of crisis, there is a constant stream of, I don't want to call them necessarily escalations, but moves that all have their counter move. So by all means, let's spin, but I do hope that in the sort of the councils of government, they're fully aware that this is a new move. Doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be doing it, but we have to recognize it for what it is.
I wanted to ask you, Mark, about how Vladimir Putin is dealing with the Kursk incursion in terms of the messaging inside Russia. I've heard a lot of people say that he's almost trying to play it down and he doesn't want to big it up too much because it draws attention to the fact the war has literally come to Russian territory. Is that your reading of things?
Yeah, and it's interesting, the very fact that he can't even actually name it for what it is, a Ukrainian invasion or incursion or whatever. We have all these euphemisms, the current situation, these circumstances. And it's fascinating because it's very reminiscent of how he dealt with the opposition leader Alexei Navalny. You know, while he was alive, he would never refer to Navalny by name. It would always be that individual or so forth. It's almost like actually the things that he genuinely fears, like Voldemort, he can't actually bring himself to name them. So in that context, yes, he's trying to play it down because I think the reason is that, apart from the fact that it was just deeply embarrassing to have Russian territory being taken by the Ukrainians, but also more broadly, I think it's calculated in a very bloodless kind of way, but actually it makes sense, that in fact, better from his point of view to maintain the effort on pushing forward on the Donbass front in eastern Ukraine, and accept that there's going to be Ukrainian territory, Ukrainians holding parts of Russian territory for the next weeks, months, whatever. But it's not important territory, especially not from the point of view of Putin, who doesn't really care about his regions, than actually to focus everything on driving them out. So I think given that he reckons that this may well be something that will take some time to address, he doesn't want to make too big a deal of it because that builds up expectations. People will be thinking, well, when is Russian territory going to be free? Why are they not free yet? And he doesn't want to divert his primary forces, his seasoned veterans, away from the Donbass front to deal with this Kursk incident.
And to what extent has the Kursk incursion weakened Putin's position domestically? And who will he be most concerned about? Some of the ultranationalist Russian military bloggers have been quite critical of Russian tactics and operations in recent weeks and months. But then you've also got some oligarchs speaking more freely in opposition to the war in Ukraine. I think Oleg Deripaska was on a trip to Japan relatively recently and criticised the war in Ukraine, the fact that he feels he can speak out, how significant is that?
Yeah, I mean, to deal with the Deripaska issue, it's often difficult to know because there's a degree in which there's a kind of calibration and calculation in that certain figures, they're more or less given a certain amount of leeway in order to create, it's also all very much theatricality, to create the impression that there is a degree of pluralism when there really isn't. This is still a personalistic, authoritarian autocracy. In terms of the impact on Putin, though, I think that there's a paradox here. In that, on the one hand, it absolutely has weakened him. I mean, if one thinks back, what were the two pillars of his legitimacy historically? It's always been, first of all, prosperity. You can tell ordinary Russians, look, next year is going to be even better than last year. It's a lot harder for most Russians to believe that in the current situation, particularly with inflation rising, the economy sort of showing some signs. I mean, it can last for some time, but it's not a comfortable situation for the economy. And the other pillar was security, that Putin is the man who can keep Russia and Russians safe. Well, that too is now being eroded. So, there is a sense in which people are feeling that Putin is not living up to his social contract. And in some ways that the old man, it's interesting how often he's now referred to as like grandfather and so forth, just basically no longer has what it takes. But at the same time, there's also an inevitable rally around the flag effect. People see a foreign army on Russian soil, and there is that sense, this very sort of strong, loamy national patriotism that says now is not the time to be trying to sort of challenge or undermine the regime. So I think what we're actually seeing is a situation in which, in the short term, Kursk actually kind of strengthens Putin's position, because, as I say, this is not the time to destabilize the situation. But pressures, discontents are absolutely building up. And interestingly, amongst a whole bunch of different segments of the population, you mentioned the ultranationalists, the so-called turbo patriots. They clearly are thinking not just that they have a problem with the war so much as they have a problem with just how incompetent its management has been. You've got the oligarchs who are seeing their business empires under risk and their opportunities of being able to continue to enjoy the fruits of being connected to the outside world limited. And you have ordinary Russians who may not know exactly what's going on, but they're terrified, for example, about a new mobilization wave. And they just feel there is clearly something wrong if part of your territory is under foreign occupation. So I think for all of these reasons, you have tensions that are building up, but they're being kept at bay by the war. And in some ways, that's what scares me. Because although I've never believed that Putin went into Ukraine because he feared some kind of internal protest at home, it may well reach a situation in which Putin doesn't feel that he can afford to end the war, because he knows it's that patriotic surge is the only thing that keeps at bay all the discontent that has built up. So it's a very long answer, I'm afraid. Sorry, to a simple question, but I think it's an interestingly complex question.
And on the topic of mobilization, will he be reluctant to do that out of fear of what the public reaction may be?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about that. For a long time, his generals have been telling him, you really want us to be making ground in Ukraine, we need more troops. But the first mobilization wave that was carried out in autumn of 2022 was so disruptive. Remember, for every soldier they managed to bring to the ranks, 2 to 3 Russians fled the country and was just very, very unpopular. Well, Putin, who is, after all, a very risk-averse figure, ironically enough, clearly didn't want to do it before the presidential elections. Then, while he was contemplating it, we had the Prigozhin mutiny sort of story as well. For all of these reasons, there's a lot of, each time there's some kind of a challenge. Putin kind of backs away. Now, if he orders a mobilization today, he won't have his troops, frankly, until late autumn, by which point the conditions in Ukraine are not really very propitious for major offensive operations. So, yes, the generals would love to see it, but so far at least Putin's timidity has, fortunately, kept that from being started.
And I suppose as well, he will be waiting to see what the result is of the US presidential election in November. And on that note, of course, we're recording this in the hours after what appears to be a second attempted assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump. And it's interesting that the suspect in question, who's been arrested, has links to Ukraine. He went out to Kyiv in 2022. He tried to coordinate efforts to recruit US nationals to fight on behalf of Ukraine. Now, obviously, the Ukrainian government have distanced themselves from him and said that he was frankly delusional. But it's interesting how the Ukrainians have also said they expect the Kremlin to try and exploit the situation and spread disinformation to try and undermine American support for Ukraine. I mean, this presumably is just absolutely part and parcel of the Putin playbook, Mark.
Absolutely, it's a gift to the Kremlin, and frankly, they would be, one has to acknowledge, stupid not to take fullest advantage of this. And particularly, what's powerful about this is, you talked about disinformation. The most effective forms of information operations are those that are actually rooted in the truth. So rather than just creating something out of nothing and hoping people believe you, it's taking something that is real and just seeing how far you can spin it. So absolutely, we are going to see this as an important new battle line in the information operation. And the problem is that at present, because no one really knows quite why he did it, what was his motivation or whatever. Was it because of Ukraine? Was it nothing to do with that? Was it just simply that he wanted fame? Who knows? So actually, at the moment, you have a window of opportunity in which Russia's propagandists will be spinning everything that they can, and no doubt not just presenting one narrative, but many narratives, all of which go against both the Democrats in America and also Ukraine. And it's that much harder to combat when you haven't really got a solid line of information to be able to spin against it.
And I'm guessing, in particular, the fact that it was Donald Trump who was targeted. Donald Trump has been far more skeptical about American support for Ukraine than the Democrats, for instance, the Biden administration and Kamala Harris's campaign. And so they will be sensing an opportunity to further fuel skepticism about support for Kyiv among Trump's base.
Yes, I think there'll be two elements. I mean, on the one hand, look, the Russians are not totally naive about Donald Trump and the fact that there is often a yawning chasm between what Donald Trump plans to do, or says he's going to do rather, and what he actually does. But nonetheless, it is clear from their point of view that they would prefer a Trump victory to a Harris victory. So on the one hand, we're going to see this being used as a way of supporting Trump, whether it's from insinuations about, I wonder who was backing this man and so forth, all the way through to, Trump is a brave man who's willing to stand up, and he will not be silenced or intimidated. So that will be one narrative. And then at the same time, there will, as you say, be a Ukraine skeptical narrative that says, why are Ukraine's friends so terrified of Donald Trump that they're willing to use violence and assassination, and who was backing this man and all the other things. I'm sure we're going to see some kind of implications that HUR, Ukrainian military intelligence, which after all has been behind a series of assassination campaigns inside Russia, somehow may have been supporting him or egging him on or whatever. This is unfortunately a story that writes itself from the Russian propagandist point of view.
I wanted to ask you, Mark, as well, as to whether you have noted a shift in tone among Ukraine's Western allies in recent days and weeks. Whereas before it was very much, look, we are with Ukraine all the way, whatever it takes. Obviously, that is still very much the sentiment, but I'm picking up a bit more, we need to help Ukraine win, we need to think about ways to bring this war to an end. Is that a shift that you have also noticed?
Yes, definitely. And in the process, we're actually seeing a widening gap, particularly within Europe, I would say, between countries, particularly frontline states like Poland and the Baltic states, which are still very, very strongly committed, and other countries that, frankly, would just like this war to go away. And a lot of it comes down to almost the semantics, like a win, victory, Russia must lose. Everyone can use these kind of terms while meaning totally different things. So, for example, for some Western countries, a victory for Ukraine means Russian troops out of every single square centimetre of occupied territory, reparations and the like. To others, it just simply means, well, most of the territory is back in Ukrainian hands, or at least the shooting has stopped. So, I think this is one of the problems, because we never really in the West have dared to have that conversation about how we really think this ends. And as many countries are getting, frankly, fed up, there's no way getting around it, of the huge amounts of money, there are billions of pounds, euros and dollars that are, after all, spent on supporting Ukraine every month. To a degree, ironically, I think this has got worse or more visible since actually President Biden stepped out of the electoral campaign. Because I think there was, and certainly in some countries, you can actually get people off the record to admit this. There was almost a sense of, well, Trump's likely to win, and Trump is going to impose some kind of ceasefire, because he'll threaten the Russians with increasing military aid if they don't accept it, and the Ukrainians will with cutting it if they don't accept it. And then, in a way, to a degree, we're off the hook. Because if America does stop supporting Ukraine, Europe cannot make up the shortfall. They can spend more money, but they just don't have the military productive capacity to be able to make it up. So in some ways, it would have provided a perfect alibi for countries which would like to actually step away. Then they can say, look, if it was up to us, we'd keep supporting Ukraine, but with the Americans now out of the coalition, it's all senseless and it's good money being thrown after bad. So I think that, we are seeing a degree of Ukraine fatigue at the level of certain, when I stress this, certain elements of certain governments, and a sense of just wouldn't it be good to try and end it. But at the same time, when it comes down to it, it is clear that Zelensky is signaling. I mean, he has his new victory plan, which is meant to be also in part a peace plan. He's signaling that he's not willing at the stage to countenance any kind of peace for land deal. And America is the only country which could conceivably be in a position to force him to change that position. So, I think we're not really advanced any further. This is just more grumbling than anything that I think is going to lead to real policy change, unless we see something happen in American politics.
And let's say hypothetically there were serious peace talks. What could Vladimir Putin accept? What could he sell internally in Russia as a kind of moral victory that equally the Ukrainians might go for?
This is the issue. I think from Putin's point of view, and obviously, the honest answer is, he will want anything he basically feels he can get. And particularly if this is a peace plan that is pushed by the West, he will feel in a stronger position. So, I think what he will want to do is essentially trying to hold on to all the territories that he's got at the moment, de facto, if not de jure, and wants to stop Ukraine from certainly being part of NATO. And, well, it's unclear whether he would really care if Ukraine is part of the EU or not. But essentially, that's it. He wants to hold on to this territory. I cannot see that being acceptable to Ukraine, both because, it would mean basically surrendering 20% of their territory, but also because the Ukrainians, ironically, like the Russians, see time as being on their side. There is that sense that they're now, better armed than before. They're finally getting the pipeline of new recruits, getting it sorted, so that in a few months' time, they will have stood up a series of new brigades, fresh brigades, which is, after all, what everyone wants, is fresh troops, such that they'll be in a position next year to be able to launch a new counterattack and put them in a much better position. So, look, there's a lot of talk about this, but to be perfectly honest, at the way things stand at the moment, I think Putin is not willing to make the kind of concessions that could possibly appeal to the Ukrainians, because he will want to hold on to not just Crimea at this stage, but also at the very least the land corridor connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. And I cannot see Zelensky, frankly, even just politically surviving, even if he was actually willing to take that deal.
So does that mean that you think we're still, unless it's really pushed for by, let's say, a President Trump, if he were to win again, you cannot see successful peace talks anytime soon?
I so wish I could answer in any other way, but no. I think when it comes down to it, one or both sides still has to become more exhausted by the war, more willing to accept that its position in 6 months or 12 months' time will be worse than now. And at the moment, there's really no signs of the kind of give on either side.
And just finally, Mark, on the Kursk incursion, for how long do you think Ukraine will be able to or will want to hold the territory they've captured?
This is a difficult question, and so much of it depends on how much force the Russians are willing to throw at it. They could reconquer it, I wouldn't say easily, because the Ukrainians have shown how dogged they can be in the defense. But if they're willing to, for example, precisely transfer forces away from the Donbass front, given that Putin still seems determined to fight this particular incursion on the cheap, largely just using the kind of whatever random forces he can gather from all around the country. I mean, there are exceptions. The 51st Airborne Regiment, for example, which is a relatively, well, I won't quite say elite, but certainly a relatively good unit, has been identified there. But even then, I think it's not that it was necessarily was transferred away from other combat operations. It was just part of the rotation. So, on the level, the current level of resourcing, the Russians are not in a position to quickly take Kursk back. And the Ukrainians have the option, if they do really want to hold on to this territory, of surging more troops in, albeit at the cost of the other fronts. The interesting thing is, though, what is the intent? I mean, at first, it looked as if this was meant to be a relatively limited operation time-wise. But now we're talking about, well, President Zelensky is talking about this being, for indefinite period of time, of it being a buffer zone against Russian attacks, or indeed being a bargaining chip in some kind of future negotiations. Now, that implies that they're planning on holding on to at least part of this territory in the long term. So, I mean, I think it's really going to be just simply a question of the algorithm of commitment. Who is willing to devote the resources necessary to hold on to it? If the Ukrainians do not decide that it's actually something that they really need to do, then I imagine at some point we're going to see a controlled withdrawal after they feel they have embarrassed and bled Russia enough. But last point, and I'm unfortunately seem to be in a very downbeat mood today, is my concern is this becomes a little bit like the battle for Bakhmut, where you had, the city that was of really minimal strategic value, and yet which became something of a grudge match between the two sides. Originally the Ukrainians had planned to just hold it briefly to try and bleed the Russians of some of their best troops and slow down their advance. But then they ended up digging in both physically and psychologically. And by the end of the conflict, the entire city had been leveled. There had been massive losses on both sides. And one could argue, to what end? So, the risk is that this Kursk incursion becomes another one that almost becomes a psychological tussle rather than a military strategic gambit. We'll just have to wait and see.
Mark, always appreciate your insights and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Spot on. Lovely stuff. Thank you so much, Mark.
No